Happy Wednesday, day after the primary elections. Yeah. Okay.
Post-election hangover is what
not the
people call it.
Yeah, the primary. Yeah,
Primary.
I'm tired.
Wow. Yes. How much election did you have?
Yeah. So thanks for watching The Big Picture. We're going to break down some of those races right now. A lot of, some of them expected.
Sure.
And then obviously several of the levy failures that we saw around the region. We'll address some of those levy failures coming up later around 9:40 this morning. But right now, I do want to bring in Dr. Nicole Kalaf-Hughes from Bowling Green State University. She is here to kind of talk about some of those races that we saw last night. Dr. Kalaf-Hughes, thanks for joining us on this Wednesday. Long night for you, obviously. But were there any surprises in any of the races from last night in your eyes?
I don't think so. I think a lot of what we saw was really what we expected to see. I have election results pulled up on my second monitor, so I'm going to look away for a second. But a lot of what we saw were the candidates that were expected to do well and were expected to advance. They were candidates who have already put a lot of money into their campaigns, and I think we're going to see a much larger influx of cash into our general election season, probably starting this morning. I think the really interesting races are that Ohio's 9th congressional district, which is up closer to me outside Toledo. That's probably going to be one of the most competitive races for the U.S. House, probably across the country, definitely across Ohio, but probably across the country. I think we're going to see a really competitive Senate race for that Ohio Senate seat that's up. And that one, if you recall, 2 years ago was the most expensive Senate race in the country. And I think we're probably going to see something similar going forward.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Kalaf-Hughes, looking at the GOP primary for governor, Vivek Ramaswamy, a lot of people say it was a landslide, right? More than 80%. But still, Casey Puch took 20% of the GOP votes. Is that concerning, do you think, for the Ramaswamy camp now moving into the general?
I don't know if it's concerning. It's probably about what his campaign expected for kind of the challenger. I think his campaign always expected to win. I think that's what most people expected to happen. And so what Vivek Ramaswamy's campaign is going to have to do, they're going to have to appeal to the 20% of people who did not support him, who are registered Republicans and who did vote in that primary. And they're then going to have to try to appeal to moderates or centrists who could be persuaded either way. And so that's what they're going to have to spend essentially the next 6 months now trying to do, is trying to appeal to these voters that they either didn't get last night, who are Republicans, or Democrats on the margins who may be convinced to support his campaign. What's going to be a little bit different in the fall relative to where we were, 2 years ago, is that Trump isn't on the ballot. And so it's a midterm election, which is great for many gubernatorial races in that you don't necessarily have national politics to contend with. But I think in our current environment, we always have national politics to contend with. So both campaigns are really going to have to figure out how to position themselves both for Ohio, but on a national stage as well.
And this time around, at least from some of the precincts in the state, saw incredible turnout for a primary election in a mid-cycle election. I know our sister station, WTOL in Toledo, had mentioned one of their precincts saw numbers that surpassed what they saw in the general election for the presidential year a couple of years ago. And we've seen, we saw lines yesterday here in Columbus to get into a primary. We don't typically see that in a primary election. What's driving people out right now? I mean, this one to a lot of people seems different.
I think there's a couple things depending on where you are in Ohio. So I think having a lot of people turn out is great. Everyone should vote. Voting is great. It's a delight. Everyone is encouraged to vote. I think depending on which region you're in is really going to be what's motivating turnout in a primary off-cycle election. So for some areas and some precincts and some communities in Ohio, they had school levies on the ballot. And I know you're going to talk a little bit about levies later on, but that's going to be a huge driver in an off-cycle election for people who are really passionate about the schools. For other people where they did have a really competitive primary, which Ohio 9 did if you were a Republican, that's going to drive people to turn out. So having a competitive election really motivates turnout. And we know broadly from the political science research that one of the big criticisms with gerrymandering is that you get uncompetitive elections where you have people who are pretty much guaranteed a seat based on like the partisan composition. And that lowers turnout because people don't feel like their vote makes a difference. So when people feel like their vote can actually shape policy or pick the nominee, they're more likely to turn out. So you're going to see more turnout in areas with competitive races and areas with important policy issues like school levies or other local levies that we may not see on a statewide level.
Things that will affect people's wallets.
Exactly. And like the other thing that you're probably going to see is the economy right now. Everything is tremendously expensive. And so even if you're not like picking, if you're voting in a primary election, these are not people who have like a direct effect on gas prices immediately or the price of food or that kind of stuff. But if you're feeling that directly, you may be more motivated to turn out than you were, say, 2 years ago.
And both now candidates for the governor, both Vivek Ramaswamy and Amy Acton, have both addressed that. Amy Acton used it last night in her speech. Vivek Ramaswamy told this to Doug Petcash earlier yesterday. I'm going to play a bit of that sound now. Both of them kind of recognizing that affordability is a huge issue for Ohioans right now.
And I know that American dream exists because I have lived it. A lot of young people, a lot of people of really every age don't feel like that American dream is available to them anymore. I'm going to change that.
I am running for governor because people in this state are struggling. They are doing everything right. They're working harder than they ever have, but there is no more breathing room. They're struggling with the cost of everyday life.
So we heard it there, both candidates at least recognizing that there is a problem. Amy Acton had campaigned on this basically her entire campaign season. Her entire platform is affordability. Vivek Ramaswamy also mentioning that a lot of people are feeling disenfranchised with the American dream idea. For both, how are they going, separating each other? I guess it's going to come down to their plans on how each one's going to get there. Obviously, Vivek has talked about different forms of tax cuts, and Amy Acton has talked about different kind of social programs. I guess moving forward, how do they capture the voter?
I think it depends on which candidate is able to be more persuasive. And it's going to depend on the groundwork that their campaigns do and that we see from like these affiliated nonpartisan groups. The trick is to get accurate information out to the public. And that's something that's both really challenging from just a civic engagement kind of perspective. But also if you watch both candidates, right, they're very careful in trying to pitch like an idealized version of Ohio. And that can be really hard to achieve because some of the costs right now that Ohioans are seeing cannot be necessarily controlled at the local or state level. And then the other thing, right, with tax cuts, if you cut taxes, the money still has to come from somewhere. So for the states that have a really low income tax, they have a really high property tax and vice versa. And so a lot of this is finding a way both in their platform and in their campaigns to kind of balance the challenges that come with running a large state like Ohio. And then also being able to translate that into effective policy if they are elected. It's very easy to make a lot of promises right now. It's significantly harder to translate that into effective policy. And so I think it's going to be really important for the campaigns to make sure that voters understand what their platforms are, but also for voters to understand how they will accomplish that if elected, because it's not just getting into office that matters, but once you're there, you have to be able to do what your constituents want and to be able to do it successfully. And that's really challenging. And neither of these candidates has served in an elected office before. Right. So it's a really rare election.
Because you don't have a proven record of what their decisions and the impact they've made. I want to ask you real quick, Dr. Kalaf-Hughes, let's talk about the Ohio Supreme Court, because I think that one is still out there. Last I saw, 95% of the votes, but Republican Colleen O'Donnell has a very slight lead for the GOP nomination. Another reason why people need to go out and vote in these primaries, because we're not just talking police, fire, levies, and schools. We're talking people who can make decisions that go far beyond what's affecting our wallets. This one's still pretty close.
Yeah, I think this just really reinforces the importance of actually showing up. A lot of our races have been decided by very small numbers, and which again, great to have a competitive election, but it really matters that if people show up. And for races like the court, right, where you may not think about it on a daily basis, but the Ohio Supreme Court even made an important decision this week in terms of who was eligible to run in this election. So the Ohio Supreme Court may seem abstract to a lot of voters, but it's very important on interpreting questions of both elections, Ohio policy, how we redraw our district lines for voting and for representation. And so some of these offices may seem abstract on the day-to-day basis, but they're really important in getting, people to represent the public. And so showing up and having these tight races matters.
And I should say, I think I needed to refresh my election page. That one may have been declared late overnight with Colleen O'Donnell taking the GOP nomination. But to your point, Dr. Kalaf-Hughes, the Supreme Court, what they decide, something that's been really huge, whether utility companies can add those fees to ratepayers' bills. And again, these are big decisions that really do trickle down to our individual homes.
Yeah, the court makes a ton of decisions, and the Ohio Supreme Court has changed a lot in the last few years, right? We're now going to have partisan elections where we didn't, say, 5 years ago. Our most recent election was partisan as well, but we used to have nonpartisan judicial elections in Ohio. We now have partisan judicial elections. So that changes some of the campaigning calculus that we see. And so even these campaigns are going to be different. If you look at, not to bring it back to the Ohio 9, right, but Ohio 9th district was decided by less than 1% last time. So getting everyone out to vote is going to be a huge factor for the campaigns, because the campaigns are really going to need to drive that turnout to win. And that's true for school levies. It's true for local police and fire issues. It is true at the state legislative level, the congressional level, and statewide office, like for the governor's seat.
Yeah.
And I want to now talk a little bit about, sorry to change topics now real fast. I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. Senate race. Sherrod Brown taking that race for the Democrats handily with 89% of the vote. So he is now going up against now Senator John Husted. So we're going to end up with two candidates with significant name recognition. Obviously, sure. John Husted, the former lieutenant governor, and has now been in the Senate. Sherrod Brown holding the seat that is now occupied by Senator Bernie Moreno for a number of years. We have these two candidates with significant name recognition. Obviously, the last race that Sherrod Brown was in and now Senator Bernie Moreno were involved in was an incredibly high dollar race, high stakes. Are we going to see that repeat again?
Yes.
Plain and simple, yes.
Just yes. And this is much more of a response from like a national political level rather than Ohio, right? Like obviously this matters for Ohio. Ohioans are going to be super invested. Ohioans know these names, right? Ohioans are going to turn out. But from a national political perspective, right, this race really matters. 2 years after a general election, so at the midterms, the president's party usually doesn't do as well. This is true if you have a Democrat or a Republican in office, right? That 2 years later, voters are not 100% satisfied, and so typically the opposition party does a little bit better. So already we would expect Democrats to do a little bit better. There was some concern about that because the Senate seats that are available tend to be more Republican, but Democrats expected to do a little bit better than they otherwise would in both House races and Senate races this fall because it's a midterm with a Republican president. Given that Trump's approval rating is so low and that stuff is so unaffordable, you're going to have Democrats do better than expected. And so that's what I think the opportunity that the Sherrod Brown campaign is really seeing here is that they've already outperformed the party in the previous election. So he did better than Democrats did statewide, kind of broadly defined. And so they're looking to kind of capitalize on that and go after the current administration. And my guess is we're going to see a ton of money flood in for that. The trick for Republicans for the Husted campaign is going to be to kind of walk that line between pure allegiance to the current administration, which may turn off some kind of moderate voters, and representing Ohio and what Ohio voters want. And that's going to be kind of a tricky line to walk. And you're going to see both national party organizations, super PACs, individual donors dump a ton of money into this Senate race. And so I think we're going to start seeing that happen pretty soon here. And probably in a couple months, we're all going to be very tired of campaign ads.
I think I saw a new campaign ad already this morning for one of the camps. Dr. Nicole Kalaf-Hughes, thank you so much for joining us. Poli-sci professor from Bowling Green. Great insight today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.